I don't know about you, but I have a lot of books on my physical TBR that I have not gotten around to reading yet, and I haven't stopped buying new books. And let me tell you, that's a recipe for disaster with a lot of unread books and not a lot of space. Honestly, when I scanned all my unread books a few months ago, I expected to maybe have around 100, maybe 150 max, but I was absolutely blown away to have just under 200, and I feel like that was a bit of a wake-up call for me, where I realized that I actually had to buckle down and start reading the books I bought, because every book I have bought in my life, I bought for a reason, you know, to read it. And yet, in this world we live in, constant recommendations, constant influx of information and content, new interesting sounding books being published every single month, I found myself constantly reading other books, new releases, buying a new book and immediately reading it, and ignoring my entire TBR bookshelf. So I decided to start this challenge inspired by Emily Fox, and this is my third month doing this challenge. I started back in July. Here are the rules if this is your first time watching one of these videos. Basically, every single week I use a wheel that's loaded with all my titles on it, spin it to randomly select the book I'll read that week, and then I have one calendar week, 7 days, to either read that book or, if it's not working for me, DNF it and unhaul it. And then at the end of the week, I'll tell you what I thought or why I DNF'd on TikTok and Instagram, and at the end of the month, I'll compile all my thoughts in longer form here in a reading vlog on YouTube. I do have 5 passes, my self-compassion clause, which is something we talked about more in detail last month. Now, those of you who watched last month's reading vlog, or those of you following me on Instagram and or TikTok, will already know what the first pick is, but for those of you who aren't, let's spin the wheel and figure out what I'm gonna read for the first week of September. Yes, that's right, we have a Russian classic on our hands, and without further ado, let me get started on The Master and Margarita. Hello, I'm back. I read the first chapter of The Master and Margarita, and I'm trying to remember to do this now because y'all have said that you enjoy it, to come back after the first chapter and give you my first impressions before I go away and read a little bit more. So I'm going to do that this time because I remembered. So here I am. The first chapter is pretty short. Takes us to page 14 or so, but I'm already loving it. I'm already so intrigued. You can see I used what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 tabs already in the first chapter. I definitely really enjoy the writing style. There's always a bit of anytime you read a book, especially from a new author, you're kind of playing with fire. That's not the right saying. You're kind of, gambling. That's probably a better metaphor, with whether the author's style is going to work for you or not. But then when something's translated, you have that extra layer, because not only do you have to get along with the author's style, but you also have to get along with the translator and how they've chosen to interpret the work. My research told me that this was the best translation, so this is the one I got. It's the one translated by Bergen and O'Connor. It had good reviews in classic literature spaces online, so this is the one I got. But combination of the translators and also Bulgakov himself, I imagine, really liking the writing style. It's very readable, very digestible, not too wordy, which I typically like, but I don't mind when things are a little bit more straightforward. This also has a very dry humor to it, which I love. I also, while I don't know a huge amount about what happens in the book and I haven't been spoiled, I do have sort of a loose idea of some of the themes and some of the characters who may or may not be involved. So I wasn't surprised by the little bit of a potentially supernatural element that we got in the first chapter, and by the pretty heavy focus on discussing religion and Jesus specifically in the first chapter. I really liked how it was introduced and found the first chapter very intriguing. It definitely has that humorous tone and is kind of tongue-in-cheek or self-aware, but also does have a bit of a mysterious, unsettling, uncanny vibe to it that really intrigues you, or at least intrigued me, and pulls me in, where I really want to know more about these characters and what's going to happen and where this is going. So great first chapter, I think. I had a really good time with it. We start with these two men who are having a discussion, and then a third man shows up and overhears what they're talking about and sort of inserts himself into their conversation. And they're talking about Jesus from a perspective of Jesus never having existed. And this other man is seemingly shocked by their assertion that they are atheists. And then it goes on to say, the important information had apparently made a really strong impression on the traveler, since he anxiously scanned the surrounding buildings as if in fear of spotting an atheist in every window, which made me laugh out loud. Because I do feel like sometimes atheists are talked about like boogeymen, which is funny because we're a group who are united by the fact that we don't believe in something. So I don't know how scary that is. But anyway, just funny to me. While the writing is pretty straightforward, I would say, very easily readable, there are a couple little moments that are very vividly descriptive, which I love. So definitely making it very easy for you as a reader to build an image in your mind of what's happening, which I always love because I have a very vivid visual imagination. So I like when authors give me enough detail so that I can really imagine the setting and all the characters and whatever's happening in great detail. And I already feel like that's happening. So that's kind of all I can say for the first chapter, because it's one chapter and it's only, a few pages long, but definitely very excited to keep reading this from that first impression. But anyway, that's it for my first impressions. I'm going to go read to the 50% mark, and then I'll be back to share more thoughts. Hello friends, it's been almost the entire week, but I finally got to the halfway point of The Master and Margarita, and oh my god. Why didn't y'all warn me how absurd this is? Wow. Honestly, okay. I probably should have known from that first chapter, but the first chapter, honestly, it did not really prepare me for what was to come. I still don't feel prepared for what's to come because I honestly have no idea. Considering all the things that happened in the first half, I feel like literally anything could happen in the second half, and I probably wouldn't be surprised at this point because we have really explored everything and the kitchen sink at this point. This has been extremely fun to read so far. This might be the most fun or close to the most fun that I've ever had reading a classic in my life. I'm sure part of that can be attributed to the translation, but also I'm sure in large part thanks to Bulgakov himself. I've never read any of his books, but apparently I've been missing out because this is very much my humor. It is so slapstick and ridiculous and surreal and strange. Honestly, at several points as I was picturing the scenes that were happening and some of the dialogue back and forth, it truly felt like a Monty Python sketch, which I grew up on and absolutely adore. Just so odd and out there and hard to wrap your brain around and understand in the best possible way. Of course, it is using that absurdity, the surrealism, for social commentary and to carry the plot forward, but it's just so fun and entertaining to read. So I'm having a great time, to be honest. I'm trying to think what I can say in a non-spoiler section because truly so much happens relatively early in the book and characters are introduced that I feel if I were to talk about them in a non-spoiler section, it would ruin the reveal for you if you haven't read this book yet. There are just characters and situations and events, pretty much everything that happens that is surprising and shocking, especially for the first quarter, I would say, till you just fully have to surrender to the absurdity of it all and accept that anything and everything can happen. But up to that point, I feel like you're still trying to, or at least I was still trying to make sense of everything and logic my way through it and try to guess what would happen next. And I just feel like I don't want to ruin that experience for you if you haven't read it yet. So let me think about what I can say that isn't spoilery. The writing, again, it's translated, so it's hard to judge the writing style, the prose itself, because I'm not reading the original Russian. I do really enjoy the writing style, but it's definitely pretty straightforward. It's not overly flowery or poetic necessarily. I feel like the moments that are a little bit more lyrical or have longer, more intricate sentences are for effect and usually for comedic effect. Although there are a couple chapters, and one in particular that I'm envisioning, that was incredibly creepy, almost felt like reading a horror novel all of a sudden, and was very atmospheric and spooky and incredibly tense, and the tension just kept building through the whole chapter. And I do feel that the writing style shifted subtly in the chapter to enhance that feeling overall, which was very effective. But again, it's hard for me to separate that and identify how much of that is how it was originally written and that's coming through, and how much of that is the choices that were made by the translators, because I have seen some excerpts from another popular translation and it's a very different writing style. But in terms of non-spoiler things to say, I do find the commentary, the political and social commentary on Russia in this time period in the 30s, late 20s and early 30s, and some of the sort of natural absurdity of the regime and the way it's run, and some of the hypocrisies and logical leaps and some of the hoops that people have to jump through and some of the norms that just seem absolutely ridiculous when you kind of take a bird's eye view, or if you're looking at it from the outside. I do think Bulgakov had a lot to say about his experience as a creative, as an author, and I believe he was also a playwright in Russia at this time when so much of art and media was controlled and had to follow the party line and promote a certain message, especially because my understanding is that he himself was a religious man, and the Soviet Union at the time espoused and supported atheism on a regime level and did not want its citizens to practice religion or believe in God. And there is a sort of subplot that has to do with Jesus and Pontius Pilate and the idea of whether devils and gods exist that is running through this, in addition to quite a few characters who are involved in theater and poetry and journalism and literature and music, opera and plays at the time, and sort of the barriers that they were bumping up against trying to express themselves and create art within very strict confines. And it does seem like that was something that Bulgakov himself was facing, especially because this specific book was blocked from publication, was censored for, what was it, at least 30 years is my understanding. It wasn't actually published until the 60s. And that's something that a prominent character in this novel is also experiencing, the censorship of his novel that includes some religious content, just like this book does. So there's a bit of a parallel there between real life and fiction. But like I said, there's so much comedy, there's so much absurdity, and I don't even know how to describe some of these scenes in a non-spoiler way that gets across to you how ridiculous they are in the best way possible. You'll just have to read it. And I, at least so far, my experience of the first half, I would recommend. So I think that's all I can say in a non-spoiler way, to be honest. I really don't want to ruin anything for you. And it's very hard to even tell you the premise, to be honest, without spoiling some of the early reveals. I'm glad that I knew very little about this going into it. I knew there was a cat, a black cat specifically, which I was excited about, and I knew one of the other characters who would show up, and I'm not going to even tell you that part because it's a bit of a spoiler, and I kind of wish I hadn't known. But definitely having a great time, very much enjoying this, spending a lot of time shocked and also laughing, which is great. And like I said, a couple chapters that are pretty intense and scary, some gore, which I did not expect, and yeah, a few scenes that are very tense, and even some scenes that are played for laughs that are comedic, but also simultaneously quite terrifying if you think about them in a more literal way. If you consider being in the position of the people that are experiencing what's happening, it's absurd, but it's also terrifying. So very interesting combination of things. I'm really curious to see where this goes and how it kind of ties together this social commentary and also this subplot of Jesus in his time. But now let's talk about spoilers for the first half of The Master and Margarita. Spoilers starting now. Do not watch this if you have not read The Master and Margarita and you want to, or think you might want to, okay? I'm looking at you. Okay, spoilers starting now. So, what a ride. Where do I even start? In the first chapter, we meet the devil, and the devil meets two atheists who don't believe the devil exists, and the devil is like, oh yeah, is that so? Well, what if I predict one of your deaths and then it happens in an hour or two? Then will you believe me? And then one of them dies, exactly how he says they will, and the other one starts to lose grip on reality, because who wouldn't have that experience? There's also a little interlude there where he tells the story of Jesus meeting Pontius Pilate and being condemned to death, and talks about it like he was there and asserts that he was there at that time, which is also a little baffling to these two atheists who also don't believe in a mortal life or time travel. So it starts off with a bang, and with a beheading, which is quite intense and gory, like I said. But then things really go off the rails and things get very absurd very quickly, because our second atheist starts chasing after this man because he believes he somehow murdered his friend, and spots a basically human-sized, or I think they said hog-sized, black cat that walks and runs on its back legs like a human and tries to pay the trolley driver and get on to ride public transit, and then is kicked off, but is acting like a human and also has a mustache. So there's that. And we get this ridiculous, absurd chase scene all through Moscow that just gets more and more ridiculous as it goes on. Very Monty Python vibes. And it just escalates from there. Our poet gets sent to a sanatorium. We continue to interact with our talking, mustachioed, almost human-sized cat who walks on his hind legs. We are introduced to a character who can levitate, apparently. We see a variety of types of magic take place. We also see a woman who seems to possibly be dead. Maybe she's a zombie, maybe she's a vampire, not sure, levitating outside of a window, being able to stretch her limbs like Elastigirl. We have the ability to make someone disappear, but their clothing continue to move and function and talk as if they were still there. There was a lot going on, and there seems to be a direct correlation, causation, I should say, between characters in Moscow running into this nefarious group and having their lives totally torn apart and ruined in the next 2 to 3 hours, I would say. Either they end up in the madhouse, or they're transported to a completely different location, or they age incredibly rapidly, or they're arrested by the Moscow police. For the most part, for being in possession of foreign currency, that is a refrain that comes up at times to a ridiculously hilarious degree, but it's a constant refrain in this novel so far. There's just so much happening, and we also have 2 chapters so far that go back to the time of Jesus and Pontius Pilate and are telling that secondary storyline, and so far it's very unclear how that ties in with the rest and what we're trying to say with that part of the novel. But the modern day, set in the early 30s, portion of the novel seems very clearly to be satire and absurd commentary on the state of Russia at the time and how ridiculous and illogical it must have felt to live under that regime, and all of Bulgakov's frustrations coming out at community housing and the restrictions on artistic expression and religious freedoms and so much else. Very interesting so far, very silly. The chapter that really got to me that was actually quite terrifying is this character who gets back to his office, I believe, who is talking to who he thinks is his coworker, sort of hiding in the shadows, and eventually he realizes that it definitely couldn't be his coworker. The whole scene is incredibly tense as he slowly starts to realize that something's wrong and this isn't the person he thought it was, and he's in this office alone at night with this stranger who is increasingly menacing, and then suddenly sees a seemingly the naked corpse of a woman outside his window, levitating, who then reaches her arm in and, like Gumby Elastigirl, stretches her arm to let herself in the window, and is a rotting corpse coming for him. It was very intense. Okay? Again, no idea where we're going with that whole section of the novel, but definitely interesting nonetheless. It does feel like our devil and his little cadre of demons, presumably, are specifically targeting people who are sinning, which is interesting because you wouldn't think that the devil would want to stop people from sinning. Typically, at least I have always thought of the devil as someone who enjoys a little sin here and there. But this devil seems to very much dislike people who are greedy or prideful or liars or what have you, and specifically seeking them out and punishing them, which is very interesting. So we'll see where it goes with that, but it's very entertaining. That's what I'll say. I'm having a really good time with it. I'm also learning a lot about Russia at this time. I'm learning about things like Aquinas and his proofs for God's existence. I did a little side quest research on that, and also Kant's thoughts on Aquinas and his proofs, and Kant's sort of additional proof. There are also a lot of references to other playwrights and authors and composers. There's a lot of reference to opera in general, and specifically Faust, both the play Faust, but predominantly the opera Faust, of which apparently Bulgakov was a big fan. Apparently he just loved opera in general, so that keeps coming up, which is really interesting. And that also sort of bleeds through his writing in general. For example, he is constantly describing what kind of voice type everyone has. So for example, someone might have a bass or a baritone or a tenor voice, and it's really funny to read as someone who studied voice in college, to have people's voices described that way. It's very evocative for me. And I will also say that I have a sort of surface level working knowledge of Faust, and I'm also doing some more research as things come up, as references come up, but I have not read it myself. So maybe that's a project for after I finish this book. But I think that's it for spoilers though. But like I said, the scenes themselves, the events themselves, even the pacing and the structure of a lot of the scenes feel very slapstick comedy, absurd, surreal, ridiculous, comedic, fast-paced, I would say. Honestly, the slowest paced chapters are the two set in ancient times. And I think part of it is just that they have been relatively long chapters, but also that so far they feel a little out of place in the novel because we don't know exactly how they're going to tie into everything. So right now they feel a little like separate little islands of narrative on their own, but they're also much more serious and played straight in comparison to the silly comedy of the main narrative. So there's that too. But anyways, I think that's it. I've been talking long enough. I'm having a really fun time with this, so I'm going to go finish it, and I'll be back when I'm done to share my final thoughts. I have finished The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov, and words escape me, to be honest. I feel like this doesn't happen to me that often because I'm very verbose naturally. I've never really struggled with the whole expressing myself verbally thing. But this book is hard to describe and hard to encompass in a single review, but I endeavor to attempt it. So I think I said at some point in this video so far that I really didn't know anything about this. And honestly, I'm glad for that because this was such an absurd, ridiculous, silly at times, but also very heartfelt and serious and earnest satire. Yes, it is helpful to have context about the world at the time and the author's beliefs and experiences to fully understand the satire, because this is satire. But that is something you can learn about and research as you go, and that's the direction I took as I came across references or names or places that I didn't recognize. I was looking them up. I was reading all the notes in the back of my edition. I also found a website that had extensive notes about all the characters and places and weird little references and sayings that you might not know are actually common sayings in Russia. But I think to fully appreciate this novel, you either have to have pretty extensive knowledge of the Soviet Union at the time, or you have to be willing to do a little bit of research, because while this book, I'm sure, I imagine, would also be enjoyable even if you did not pay attention at all to any of the social commentary and the satire, even if you just read it on surface level without considering the subtext, I think it's an enjoyable book. It is a ridiculous, silly, absurd book, but I think you could enjoy it even without the commentary. But of course, the satire and the social commentary is the main purpose of the book and why it was written and why it has resonated so much, why it was censored for so long, but also once it was published, why it became such a beloved classic and has really remained in the collective consciousness and joined the pantheon of, world-renowned classics. The satire, the political, social commentary, the poking at the hypocrisy and absurdity of living under an authoritarian regime is quite poignant and pointed and really vacillates between the almost manic comedic quality where everything just sort of feels like a farce, and the absolute horror and terror of the unknown, of these shifting rules and expectations, of these sometimes extreme punishments for minor infractions, of a life that is so regimented and controlled. It's really quite masterfully done, pardon the pun. But all that to say, of course, you can read this however you want. If you want to read it just for the basic plot and the silliness and the almost Monty Python level of dialogue and banter back and forth and some of the escalating hilarity and confusion and just madcap situations and ridiculous moments, with a secondary through line, plot line of a retelling of Pontius Pilate's experience and part in Jesus's execution. Go ahead, feel free, do so. I think you'll still have fun with it, but I definitely think there is so much more to be gained and so much more depth in doing that research to really truly fully understand the context of the time. So starting with the structure, this is told in two timelines. We have the modern day timeline, which is late 20s Moscow, and then we have the past timeline, which is during the life of Jesus and Pontius Pilate. And the modern day timeline is the vast majority of the book. There are, I believe, only 4 total chapters in the past, maybe 5. Some of those chapters are quite long, and that plot line really does tie in to everything else. It's deeply connected to what's happening in the modern day, even though it has less page time. And then in the modern time, we have kind of 2 styles of storytelling intertwining, weaving together, telling 2 separate narratives that come together at times and then diverge and then meet again. So the one that's probably the most famous, or the one that people probably talk about the most because it definitely jumps out and is very unique and very eye-catching, is the high-octane comedy. We have a retinue of characters, mysterious characters with mysterious intentions and abilities, and they show up in Moscow one day and they cause a ruckus, to put it mildly. And this is also where the cat comes in. The cat was one of, if not my most favorite character. Probably not shocking to any of you. But those sections, those characters were largely told in an extremely hilarious, fast-paced, quippy, bantery, silly, truly at times absolutely off the walls, absurd and surreal and strange way. And I loved it. There were some chapters that just kept escalating, and every time you thought they had reached the height of how ridiculous they could get, they would get even more ridiculous. It was almost manic in its pacing at times, and truly felt, I think I said this in the halfway update, truly felt like a Monty Python sketch at times, and I grew up on Monty Python. I love it. So very silly, very ridiculous, but of course always with a message, and those sections really had a lot of subtext and an underlayer of satire about the situation in the Soviet Union at the time and what life was really like for the proletariat who were experiencing it. Things like people being disappeared on a regular basis, having to have papers to go to a store or enter a restaurant or go down the street, the constant threat of being questioned or apprehended by the police for some minor or serious infraction, real or imagined, community housing and the issues therein, inequality in access to resources and housing and good food and the arts, censorship of the arts, and especially compelling creatives, authors, playwrights, journalists, poets to tell stories in a way that frames the government and the leaders and life in Russia at the time in the most patriotic and positive and secular way possible. There's a lot going on there with all of the layers of commentary underneath and the satire and the jokes and the hilarity that sometimes gets so chaotic and so manic that it leans into horror, turning it up to 11 to the point where at times it really does teeter into terror. And because of the nature of these characters, which I won't get into for spoiler reasons, there are chapters that are framed more like a horror novel, and you do have that creepy, atmospheric, unsettling quality. There are gory, bloody moments, but it's definitely not the majority. But that too is part of the commentary. So that's kind of what I think most people think about and remember about this book. But we also, in the modern time, have this secondary story, which ironically is the story of our protagonists, the Master and Margarita, but it is and does feel, at least for the first half of the novel, very much secondary. I mean, we don't even meet Margarita until the second half of the book, and the Master we don't meet until very close to the end of the first half. And their story is told in much more of a romantic, sort of tragic, star-crossed lovers kind of way. It feels much more heartfelt and genuine in the way the characters are portrayed. Not that the other characters aren't, but they are sort of caricatures of themselves for satire purposes, whereas the Master and Margarita are representative, and many people feel that the Master is a stand-in for Bulgakov himself, and that Margarita is a stand-in for his third wife, and the wife that he was married to when he passed, as he was finishing or working on this novel, and actually dictating the novel to his wife, Elena. There's a lot more tenderness and romance and melancholy and tragedy in the way that their story is told, and there is still commentary there. The Master himself, I don't want to give too much away about who he is, because that reveal is also kind of part of the fun, but his character does tie in as well to especially the themes of censorship in artistic expression, which is something that comes up from the very beginning essentially and carries through the entire novel, and it feels very meta in hindsight, knowing that this novel was censored for so many decades and that Bulgakov himself was going through what he was commenting on. So those are kind of the two modern day timelines and two sort of different writing styles or intentions, I suppose, and the conventions that are being applied. And then in the past, I would say that the story of Pontius Pilate is told in the most serious way. It's a much more straightforward story. There is still subtext, and it ties into all the same themes that are being explored in the modern day, but it is not using more dramatic conventions like comedy or romance to tell the story. It feels more dry and realistic and grounded and historic, and that's a very interesting contrast as well, to have that extra piece in there. So that's kind of the structure and the intertwining timelines and the different sort of main players and characters in the story, really trying to not give away any spoilers here. And then in terms of themes, like I've already said, this book is a satire of life in Russia at the time. And so much of it is about the experience of living in a state of control, whether it's control of your movements, of your freedoms, of how you live your life, of what you believe in, but also control of art and artistic expression. And I think so much of this comes from Bulgakov's very strong internal belief in the power of art and in the importance of freedom in artistic expression. That's something he felt very strongly about, and it came through in his writing. It is so clear how much he values art, but also how much disdain he has for the idea of writing for the state, of compromising your artistic values and your vision to serve as a form of brainwashing or propaganda. And one of the characters in the retinue is talking to the other characters in the retinue, really trying to be vague here. And he said, "History will be the judge," which I highlighted. This particular quote was something that was commonly used and talked about in Russia at the time. And it's a commentary on Soviet ideologues who rewrote the past regularly to serve their own interests and ends, largely as propaganda. And there was a saying in Russia at the time that was, "In the West, it may be hard to predict the future, but in Russia, it's hard to predict the past," because it was constantly being rewritten. And apparently there were many dissidents in Russia who dreamt that in time, in hindsight, with enough room to breathe, with enough other people looking in with an outside view to what happened in Russia, that history would be on their side, believe their telling of events rather than the sanitized propaganda version coming from the government. There have been some academics apparently who also looked at the fact that the past chapters of this novel that look at Pontius Pilate tell the story slightly differently than how it's told in the Bible, that is meant to be an example of this sort of rewriting of the past, and it's kind of a meta commentary that ties in to this commentary here and what Bulgakov was trying to say about the sort of twisting of the narrative of history to serve political interests, essentially. And then also, of course, censorship. And then another quote that I'll bring up here as kind of part of the themes is to do with the importance of art, and again, tying it with, the importance of artistic expression and being honest and earnest in your art and not capitulating to the wants and needs and sort of the party line. But also this quote from page 271, which was, "Manuscripts don't burn." And this became a popular saying in Russia after this book was published. And it was referring to the practice in Russia that was quite common of authors either never writing down their work at all and just memorizing it so that it can't be burned and can't be destroyed by the secret police or anyone else, or this idea that even if you wrote down your manuscript and it was burned, which in the case of The Master and Margarita, as ironic as it may seem, Bulgakov did actually burn, I believe it was only part of, or maybe the entire manuscript of the novel was burned at one point by Bulgakov himself, but the kernel of the story, the truth of the story, lives in its creator, who is imagining the world and has these ideas and has a story to tell. And while you may be able to burn paper, you can't burn the story or destroy the story. It will always exist in your mind. And for the writers who are able to share their story with others verbally, tying into the tradition of oral storytelling, it's harder to destroy something that exists in people's minds. And that also ties into the idea as well, and one of the themes of the novel, of the power of art, but also the power of ideas, the power of belief, feeling galvanized and inspired and empowered to make decisions about your own life and to maybe carve your own path regardless of how you're being told you must live your life and what you must value and believe. And then another note here of a moment that really jumped out to me, and when I did more research turns out to have really stood out to a lot of readers at the time as well, which was a little back and forth on page 333 about Dostoevsky, which goes, "Dostoevsky is dead," said the citizens, but not very confidently. "I protest," exclaimed Behemoth hotly. "Dostoevsky is immortal." And this is commentary on the immortality of literature and art and ideas, once again, and the idea that even if every single one of Dostoevsky or any writer's works were destroyed, anyone who read them and internalized them and were touched by them and were changed by them carry it in their hearts and minds, and that Dostoevsky and other authors and musicians and creators can be immortal through their work and through the ways that they change the world through their art, which again is just something that felt like it came through so strongly in this novel. This novel does focus more predominantly on writers and on their contribution to this phenomenon, but also, there was a lot in here about music, about opera and classical music as well. I could really relate to the passion with which Bulgakov talked about the arts and expressed his belief in the power of words and music and ideas and individual but also collective experiences of art to change the world, essentially. I don't know if that made sense, but basically that ideas that art can be eternal, and especially ideas that encourage individuality and independent thought in a society that is so strictly controlled and regimented. Another theme that is very common throughout is religion and religious belief versus atheism. Atheism had been state mandated, essentially because the belief was that the state and that the leaders should be the only God, should be what the people believe in, who they pray to, essentially, and that religion would split their allegiances, basically, and make them harder to control. And I didn't know that, so it was interesting to think back on that first chapter and recontextualize my initial thoughts based on that information, because it really does color the interactions and what they're saying to each other in a whole different way. It really puts things in a different light. And also the continued expression of and sort of reiteration that things exist that cannot be explained lands differently and has different context to it when you take into account the fact that Bulgakov was the son of a man who taught theology, I believe, if I'm not misremembering, and that he himself sort of went through phases of different levels of belief in his life. And then kind of the final thing, I guess, or the final theme that comes up a lot is this idea of cowardice being the greatest vice. It's something that the Jesus in this novel says, and it's also something that is brought up again by other characters, and is apparently something that Bulgakov believed or said himself. He believed that cowardice was one of, if not the greatest vice or sins that someone could commit, and that the way he included it in the novel was meant as commentary on the Russian government, that he believed they were cowards for suppressing any other form of thought, any contrary opinions or beliefs, for trying to suppress freedom of expression when it came to art or journalism and rewriting history, all these things. He felt that that was a sign of their cowardice and that he believed that that was one of the greatest sins. And that's just interesting as well, that that comes up so often throughout the novel, because a lot of this book is looking at people's sins and what they've done wrong, and whether they deserve to pay for what they've done wrong, and what kind of punishment might be fair, might be just for what they've done. And it's interesting that cowardice is seen to be the greatest vice when we also have characters who do things that could be considered significantly worse, depending on your worldview. I think that's kind of it for the primary themes anyway, or the things that really jumped out to me. Also, themes of love and purpose and belief, faith, and the ability to accept what you're seeing with your own eyes, even when it seems completely unexplainable and absurd, whether that does turn into something like faith or belief, or whether it's rationalized away. Control and order versus chaos and expression and freedom, what it means to find peace and to be at peace, especially because Bulgakov was working on the novel, was dictating the novel to his wife when he passed. There is, at the ending, a bit of a meditation on death and finding peace and what that looks like. And it seems like because he was dying from a terminal illness and had time to know that he was dying, that he may have been meditating on his own death, on his mortality, and that came through in some of the themes as well. But anyway, I feel like I've been talking for ages. I have. Also, I thought this was interesting. This is a quote, I believe, from an interrogation of Bulgakov, but I have a satirical mindset. Things come from my pen which occasionally, as it seems, cause a sharp reaction in communist circles of society. I always write with a clear conscience, and I write as I see things. The negative aspects of life in a Soviet state attract my constant attention because I instinctively find a great deal of material there for myself. I am a satirist. That's my attempt at a non-spoiler or sort of overview of what I felt this novel was trying to do. And if it's not clear already from the way I've been talking about it, I really loved this. I thought this was fantastic. It was an easy 5-star for me. I absolutely loved reading it from beginning to end. I don't think there was a single chapter that I felt bored. I'm not sure there was even a single page that I felt bored. I just had a fantastic time reading it. And I felt that it was so effective both in telling an entertaining, emotionally investing story and an interesting story, but also that secondary layer of the satire was just so deftly done. It really left me thinking about so many different things and, sent me down rabbit holes researching all kinds of things that I hadn't looked into before. So I gave The Master and Margarita 5 stars, and I would highly recommend reading it if you have not yet. I will talk about spoilers just so I can actually talk about the characters and some of the events that happen, some of the plot points. It's, like I said, almost impossible, I feel, to talk about pretty much anything that happens in this novel, even in the first chapter, to be honest, without feeling like I'm spoiling it for you. So I would not recommend to those of you who have admitted to me in the comments that you watch the spoiler sections, even for books that you haven't read yet that you plan on reading, I would not do so for this. I really do think that you will enjoy it much more if you go into it with less knowledge about what's going to happen and who the characters are. So please don't watch the spoilers if you're going to read this book. And if you haven't read it, I definitely think you should. But I'm now going to get into spoilers for The Master and Margarita. So be aware, spoilers starting now for a book that was written 100 years ago, but still can be spoiled. So skip the spoilers if you don't want to hear them. They're starting now. Okay. So I did know going into it that there was a cat and that the devil was involved. I didn't know if the cat was the devil or if there were different characters. They are different characters, but the cat is a talking cat the size of a hog who walks on their back legs and has a mustache and wears opera glasses and plays chess and is a really good whistler. Anyway, the cat Behemoth was my favorite character, if you couldn't tell. And he is in the retinue of Satan, Dr. Woland. He introduces himself in the first chapter as a professor of dark magic, and he does put on a magic show at one point, but he is Satan, and he has his little retinue of demons of various kinds, including Behemoth, the cat. And as soon as he showed up in the first chapter, I knew that he was the devil because I had that spoiled for me. And I mean, I do think it's relatively obvious and you could pick up on it even if you didn't already know, but I just feel like, I don't know, it feels like a spoiler to me to know for sure that he is Satan because there was a bit of back and forth, and part of the fun of it, the start of the comedic tone, is our two main characters, or who we think are going to be our two main characters who we meet at the beginning, Ivan and Berlioz, are staunch atheists and very rational. They meet this foreigner who's shocked that they're atheists and just keeps saying, how could they know? How do they know that, the devil doesn't exist, for example? And they're very sure. And it's just funnier to have that reveal come later that no, he actually is Satan and he knows that Satan exists because he's him, and he knows Jesus lived because he was there and he saw him. But Woland's a really interesting character, and he's quite charismatic and likable, even though he's Satan, and he doesn't do too much that's terrible. He does. It's not clear if he sets up, if he causes Berlioz to die a violent, painful death, or if he just knows it's going to happen because he's Satan. But he does tell Berlioz how he's going to die, and then Berlioz promptly dies in said fashion, which sends Ivan on a bit of a spiral, as I think it would probably send anyone, to watch their friend be beheaded after some ominous stranger just said that they would be. Largely what he and his retinue do in Moscow is actually more petty things, changing random objects into money, and then they turn back again later. So then people, a cabbie gets paid to drive someone across the city, and then later the money they were paid turns into old receipts or something. Or the fact that they, as part of their magic show, had a ladies' fashion shop on stage, and all of the ladies who changed into dresses from their shop, eventually the dresses disappeared and they were on the street in their underwear, which, depending on the situation, could be catastrophic for the people involved, but are not as dastardly and evil as you might expect from literal Satan. And it's unclear if at least Berlioz was killed by Satan. Like I said, there is one other character who dies at the hands of one of Satan's retinue, but he also is implied to be a bad person. So again, it's kind of a question of what you think is just punishment for certain actions and sins. And there are characters that are poofed into Yalta all of a sudden, or age rapidly, or have the secret police called on them, and they have foreign currency hidden in their bathroom, and things like that. But all of these people, again, have sinned, they've lied, they've stolen, they have, taken bribes and been corrupt, or, whatever it is that Welland feels that he is punishing them for. It all kind of ties in for me to the epigraph at the beginning, which is from Faust. And so who are you after all? I am part of the power which forever wills evil and forever works good. And, I should have mentioned in the non-spoiler section as well that one of the major themes as well is light and dark, the sun and the moon, and the idea that light cannot exist without its counterpoint, that light does not exist without dark, that light always casts a shadow, and to eliminate all shadows from the world is to eliminate all life and existence from the world. So it does feel like Welland himself is kind of the embodiment of that idea, that he exists because without him you cannot have ultimate good. He is ultimate evil, but he also works good in the world because everything is a study in contrasts and nothing is quite so black and white or quite so simplistic. There's a lot of nuance to it there. And I imagine that for a society that was mandated to be secular and atheist, to write the devil and make him quite likable and charming actually might have not been what they wanted, in addition to having the Pontius Pilate chapters and having both the modern day timeline with Welland, but also those chapters telling the story of Jesus and his execution as real historic fact, which is not something that would have been mandated as okay to publish at the time. So in our retinue, we have Behemoth, the giant talking cat, who was my favorite. Then we have two other male demons who were distinct, but they were both just kind of dudes, if a little strange, so they didn't stand out to me quite as much as the giant talking cat. And then we also had Hela, the one woman in the retinue who was mostly naked for some reason. And that is one thing I will say about this book. For some reason, there were a lot of naked women. And I'm not sure I ever fully understood why there were so many naked women. It didn't feel like they were overly sexualized at any point, really. I feel like often people didn't even really notice that they were naked, so it didn't feel like a weird objectification thing necessarily. I have seen a couple people claim that it has to do with sexual liberation. I haven't been able to find a lot of substantiation for that. I found it a little odd, especially at the ball, where it seemed like all the men were dressed in tails and all the women were naked, including Margarita, who was the host. I'm not sure that I could really tell you definitively why it was that way. There was definitely some misogyny in the book. It was written 100 years ago. There was also some racism in the book, mainly in Satan's Ball. We do have a male character who is turned into a hog that a naked woman rides and flies around Moscow as, I guess, an embodiment of his piggishness, which is funny. But anyway, so we have the retinue. I do feel like it was interesting at the end. We kind of get not only the characters turning back into their normal forms, because apparently their forms throughout the novel were not their true forms, but we also kind of get a little bit of a wrap up of where all the characters are going and what's going to happen for them, including all the characters we met in Moscow, which was kind of fun to hear what they're all getting up to and hear about some of them finally coming home after being sent to Yalta barefoot. But we never hear about Hela again, so that's kind of sad. Because I feel like Hela was probably the member of the retinue that got the least development, and then she just kind of disappeared, so I was a little sad about that. But I'm not sure how much of that would be misogyny and how much is just the fact that this manuscript wasn't fully finished because Bulgakov died as he was working on it. And then we have the titular characters, the Master and Margarita. And the Master, like I said, seems to be inspired by Bulgakov himself. to a certain extent, and he is an author, and he's written a book about Pontius Pilate, which ties into those past chapters, and he was told that it couldn't be published. He had an excerpt published, and then it was panned by critics, and, he essentially lost the will to continue writing. It felt like he would never be able to publish it anyway. It would be censored and would be ridiculed, and so he burns his manuscript, which Margarita tries to save from the fire, and then he checks himself into a madhouse, essentially, because he feels like he has no purpose in life now, and he's lost his direction. In the madhouse, he meets our poor Ivan, the poet from the first chapter, who feels like he's lost touch with reality because of interacting with Satan and seeing his close colleague and friend beheaded in front of him, seeing a large talking cat riding a tram, and just everything that's happened to him in the day and a half or something that from the start of the novel, and he's really going through it, and he's being told by everyone around him that he must be mad, and so he's starting to believe them at this point. But the Master really does feel like a stand-in for Bulgakov himself, and maybe a period of time for the author where he felt like there was no point of continuing trying to write this story if it would never be published, and that he would never be able to express these thoughts and feelings fully and honestly while living in Russia. He did petition to try to leave Russia. I'm pulling up my phone for a second because I have a quote here from Bulgakov himself, who said, "At the end of 10 years, my strength is broken. Since I am no longer capable of surviving, since I am persecuted, and since I know that I cannot be published or staged anymore within the confines of the USSR, and since I have been reduced to nervous exhaustion, I am turning to you and requesting your intercession before the government of the USSR to exile me beyond the borders of the USSR together with my wife." So I believe he asked Stalin directly to exile him, essentially, so that he could write and publish his work freely, and he was declined the option to be exiled with his wife. And so I think the Master represents Bulgakov at his lowest point, as he says in this quote, of reaching a point of nervous exhaustion and just losing the will to continue, with the knowledge that it was futile, that no matter what he wrote, it would never be read, that it would never be allowed to exist in its truest form. And the Master, when we meet him, is in this clinic, believes that he is mad, believes that he doesn't deserve the love of his life, Margarita, and that he'll never be able to be with her or live the life that he thought he would have or write and be published, and that he's just lost himself and his purpose in life. And we get to see him slowly find himself again through Margarita saving him through a deal with the devil, essentially, and him being reminded of his purpose and given the opportunity to finish his novel. And in doing so, in writing the final line of his novel posthumously, actually, which is also quite a mirroring of what happened with Bulgakov himself, in that the novel was published posthumously and finished for him by his wife after his passing. That the Master and Margarita have actually died. They were actually killed by a member of Satan's retinue. And in the afterlife, he was given the chance to finish his novel. That actually frees Pontius Pilate from thousands of years of torment, essentially, of punishment for his part in the death of Jesus, and that Pontius Pilate is finally freed by the ending of his story that Master was telling. It's all very connected and poetic, and I loved the scene. It was quite beautifully written, that moment. And I kind of loved as well that as much as they are dead at the end, which might seem like a depressing way to end the novel, and I was kind of shocked and sad at first when I realized that they were actually dead, they do get to find peace, and he and Margarita get to live together in that peace and happiness and have freedom in a way that they never had before in Russia. And I do wonder if that was something that Bulgakov was perhaps looking forward to as he approached his own death, the idea of finally being free. And perhaps the main thing that he was worried about or regretting was leaving his wife behind, because it does seem, wow, I'm going to get emotional again, but the way he writes Margarita, it feels that he was deeply in love with his wife, and that perhaps the idea of living a long, peaceful, quiet afterlife with his wife seemed like exactly what he was dreaming of, which is quite sad to think that, your life on earth has been tormented so and controlled to such a degree that you yearn for death so you can be free. What more commentary do you need on, authoritarian, totalitarian, very controlling regimes that try to tell people how to live and how to think and what to believe than that you would look for freedom and release in death. I also really enjoyed the chapters with Pontius Pilate. I must say that I don't recall the stories from the Bible and how they're told in the Bible. I know there are differences in how it's told here. I have not read the Bible for a very, very long time, so I don't remember all those details. I do plan on rereading those passages at some point so that I can compare, so I can be reminded of how they're told in the Bible. But I actually really enjoyed those chapters, and I found Pontius Pilate to be a really interesting character. I think he was made more sympathetic and more nuanced and gray, perhaps, than how he's usually talked about or seen or portrayed. I think Margarita was also an interesting character, though she didn't get quite as much development as I maybe would have wanted from one of the two titular characters. She was interesting, but she wasn't introduced until the second half of the book, so she just didn't have as much page time as some of the other characters. I do think her devotion to the master and the way that she loved and supported his work must have been how Bulgakov felt loved and supported by his wife Elena, who took dictation and helped him write this book and was such a big piece of it. He must have felt that she was incredibly supportive and sort of his biggest cheerleader and helping him keep the faith in himself as he faced down the seemingly unbeatable foe of the USSR and their propaganda machine. And it's quite touching to see the way that the master describes their meeting, sort of love at first sight, and their eternal enduring love even into the afterlife. So as much as I would have loved a little bit more development for Margarita, or maybe just a bit more page time for her, I guess, I did find her unending loyalty and love, and also moments where we got to see her great compassion for other characters as well, and her willingness to be brave in very unusual and terrifying circumstances. But really her loyalty, her love, her support, her kindness toward the master was really endearing and sweet on her part. And again, just feels like sort of a love letter from Bulgakov to his wife. I mean, I could go through a long list of my favorite moments, my favorite chapters. I loved the chase chapter, which was chapter 3 or something, with Ivan trying to chase down Woland and the cat, and it just gets more and more absurd the longer it goes. There's another chapter later where things just keep escalating. There's one where people can't help but sing in public. That was quite funny, but also terrifying. There is the magic show scene, which was very absurd and just kept escalating and also had elements of horror. There was the one sort of pure horror chapter that was so tense and eerie and honestly quite terrifying to read, and really showed, I think, Bulgakov's skill, because it was written in quite a different style than the rest of the novel, or other than maybe one other chapter, and it was so menacing and quite well done. Just, you don't get a second to breathe for the whole chapter. It just keeps ramping up in the tension and gets quite terrifying. I also really enjoyed the chapter of the master telling Ivan his story, and I loved the chapter at the end, flying away from Moscow and all transforming back into their regular guises, their true forms, and then finding Pontius Pilate sitting in this valley, and the realization that he is still alive and that he's been being punished for thousands of years, and Satan giving the master the chance to finish his story. That scene was very emotional for me. Also the scene of Master and Margarita showing back up at their apartment and trying to settle back into what life could be like, and just not being able to accept that they're back together and everything they've seen and experienced only to be poisoned and die. And then their souls, essentially their corpses, I don't know, taken away, to fly out of Moscow with the devil. There are just so many scenes that stand out. There are so many little moments of dialogue. Oh, the scene with Behemoth the cat and Satan playing chess, and Behemoth trying to distract everyone and trick them so that he can cheat at chess against Satan himself, was absolutely fantastic. Behemoth in general was great. Him gilding his own whiskers because he wanted to be fancy for the ball. Relatable, amazing. There are just so many really vivid moments in my mind that I feel like I could truly picture so clearly. And I think that also ties back to Bulgakov being primarily a playwright in his lifetime. He has a very visual, setting the scene, almost cinematic writing style at times, and everything was so vivid and visual and clear, both visually, but also you could really imagine, or at least I could imagine, what everyone sounded like, because Bulgakov was such a fan of opera and apparently enjoyed singing himself. He would describe almost every character by their voice type, so I could also imagine what their voices sounded like, which was fantastic. Anyway, I could go on forever probably, and I feel like I'm probably missing things, and as I edit this, I'll be like, no, you forgot to talk about this, because there's so much to talk about. But I have been talking now for a long time, so I should probably stop. Those are some of my spoiler thoughts. Do feel free, if you've read this book and want to chat more, to leave a comment down below, and we can have more niche conversations about certain moments or scenes that came up. And definitely a new favorite classic. Absolutely fantastic, amazing, so good. Let's talk about it more in the comments. I will stop talking now because I feel like I'm rambling. So those are spoilers for The Master and Margarita, and those are all my thoughts. 5 stars. This was fascinating and engaging and hilarious and kind of terrifying and also quite moving and emotional, and I just loved it. So highly recommend. Go read The Master and Margarita. Okay, now that I've been talking for ages, it's time to spin the wheel, and we're going to find out what I'm going to read next. Let's go. What are we getting? Rouge Street. I was trying to read it backwards. Rouge Street. This is a newer edition. Let me find it. As you saw, I spun the wheel. We have Rouge Street, and this is a book that I bought on a whim from Book Outlet because $7 books on sale from Book Outlet is my greatest weakness and why I have so many books on my physical TBR. But this one not only has a very fun cover that immediately drew me in, but when I read the description, it sounded cool. It's a series of 3 novellas collected into one, which is fun. And this is how it describes the 3 novellas. An inventor dreams of escaping his drab surroundings in a flying machine. A criminal trapped beneath a frozen lake fights a giant fish. And a strange girl pledges to ignite a field of sorghum stalks. It sounds like it's going to be weird, and I love weird. And I believe this author is relatively new to the literary scene in China, but has been lauded, so I'm excited to give this a go. It's not too long. So we're going from a classic to something contemporary. We're going from a longer novel to just 3 novellas in one, and also going from Russia to China. So I'm excited for this one. We'll see where it takes me. I'll be back when I'm done. In a week. Okay, see you then. Hey friends, I'm back and I finished Rouge Street by Shuang Shuitao, and this was really interesting. Like I said, this is a collection of 3 novellas, and it's really focusing in on a particular street, one specific neighborhood during mostly the 80s and 90s, though there is a little bit of jumping around to different timelines, and exploring the experiences of the people who lived there in an area that was definitely intensely impacted by economic and political changes of the time, resulting in quite a bit of poverty, and because of that poverty, quite a bit of addiction and crime and mental health struggles. And I feel like that description makes it sound like this is going to be incredibly bleak and depressing, but that was not the case. This was actually quite wry and funny. It definitely had an ironic spin to it, and there was quite a bit of humor throughout, wordplay, and also just political and social commentary through the use of humor, which is something I enjoy. I will say that I don't have a huge amount of knowledge of Chinese history, and especially in this time period, so there's definitely quite a bit in here that I missed. I could tell at times that there was commentary being done that was going right over my head, so this is definitely something that I would be interested in rereading at a later date after learning more and doing more research into Chinese history in general, but really specifically this time period, sort of 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s is the main range, and then I would say 80s and 90s is really the most focused on period. I have started doing some of that research and it's been very interesting, and this is part of why I love to read books from around the world, because it does each time inspire me to learn more about a particular time and place. And I just feel like with every book I read and with every research rabbit hole those books send me down, I learn more, I expand my horizons, all of that to say that I really enjoyed reading this as much as I could tell as I was reading that a lot of it was going over my head. I liked the writing style. It was pretty straightforward, but definitely had some beautiful moments here and there, some more lyrical moments that felt quite poetic and evocative. It is translated fiction, so that can be attributed both to the author and also the translator, but enjoyed the writing style, really enjoyed the humor, felt that the sense of place was really strong. I really felt as if over the course of the 3 novellas, I was becoming deeply and intimately acquainted with Rouge Street and the people who lived there and what life was like there. I also was quite attached to the characters throughout, especially in the 3rd story. I would say that the 3rd novella was my favorite, and there were several characters in that story that really drew me in and that I became very attached to, even though each novella was quite short. I also want to note that while these novellas are largely grounded in reality, there are little sprinklings of surrealism, little moments of magical realism, or just magic, and a little bit of speculative fiction. Especially the 2nd story has the most speculative fiction elements, or the most prominent speculative fiction elements, but really all 3 have aspects that feel a little bit out of real life. And I think those heightened moments served to really reinforce the themes that were being explored, mainly memory, identity, family, loyalty, sacrifice, and survival. There were aspects that weren't my favorite, and of course, it's hard to determine sometimes what is an author's point of view and what is a character's point of view. There is quite a bit of suicide in these stories, and there's definitely a lot of rhetoric around suicide in this book that was not very kind or empathetic. A lot of framing it as cowardly or the easy way out or giving up in a way that I find quite upsetting to read and feel is very dismissive of the deep suffering that someone has to be going through to get to that point. I've only just started doing supplemental research, and I'm obviously not an expert, but my understanding is that in the 90s, China actually had one of, if not the highest, suicide rate in the globe, and that in the following 20 years or so, it was reduced significantly through concerted efforts, which I'm still looking into. So it seems like the high volume of suicide was actually a reality in China at the time. And I'm sure that that particular mindset around it, that framing of suicide, was also common because it's still common today. I just hate it with a burning passion. I find it incredibly cruel. I don't know that this is coming from the author, that this is the author's perspective so much as trying to represent how people would have seen and talked about suicide at the time. This is all I have read from the author, so I don't know, and I have not seen them talk about it in an interview or something. So I'm just putting a pin in it. I'm just mentioning it because it was something that I struggled with reading. And if that's something that is particularly close to you or your experience, you might also struggle with how it's talked about and framed here. But with the exception of that and a single use of an ableist slur starting with an R, which unfortunately was very commonly used in the 90s, I did really find this to be, first of all, a very quick read, very engaging read, and I found myself very interested in what was happening, even when I felt that some of the deeper commentary and symbolism was going over my head. I still found it enjoyable and liked the writing style, found it funny, and was invested in the characters. So with all that, I believe I'm landing at 4 stars for Rouge Street by Shuang Shuitao. I'll definitely be looking to see if I can get more of his work in translation, because it appears from reading the foreword that he is a very celebrated young Chinese author. So I would be curious to read more of his stuff, especially because I enjoyed what was here. But like I said, I will probably eventually reread this after I've had more time to learn more and get more context, because I do think that there are a lot of layers to this that just completely went over my head. So that is Rouge Street by Shuang Shuitao. And now I guess that means it's time to spin the wheel yet again to find out what I'm going to read next week. Let's do it and find out what we get this week. I really don't know what to expect. We're getting all kinds of things. What is this? How to Read Now. Oh, that's fun. Nonfiction, very meta, a nonfiction book about how to read. So the wheel landed on How to Read Now, which I bought on the recommendation of several bookish creators who I follow, whose opinions on books I respect. And a lot of them were talking about how this really helped them reframe their point of view when it comes to why they read and how they read, which is something I find really fascinating. I just made a video about how to read critically. I often talk about reading more critically, why we read, the importance of reading diversely, how reading can improve so many of our soft and hard skills. This should be interesting, and I'm very curious to see if this changes my outlook on reading at all, if I have any fundamental shifts, or if it just reinforces what I already believe, or maybe I'll really disagree with all her ideas. I have no idea. I don't know anything about her opinions or, where she stands on any of these ideas yet, but I'm excited to dive in. So I'm going to go get started on this, and I'll see you next week. Hello friends, I am back again and I have finished How to Read Now by Elaine Castillo, and this took me on a journey, okay? I don't think I've ever been so immersed and emotionally impacted by an essay collection, honestly, since maybe Helen Macdonald's essay collection. I can't remember the title off the top of my head, but I'll put a picture of the cover here, which moved me deeply. This one, honestly, perhaps because it's about a topic that I feel strongly about, and also because Elaine Castillo herself was so vulnerable and open and earnest in so many of these essays. I just felt very connected to her and to her ideas and to how fervently she believes in the power of reading deeply and closely and honestly and truly seeing what's there and all of the context, the historical context, the cultural context, not just reading on the surface, but going deeper to truly understand the books you're reading and all the things that make them what they are and made the authors who they are, instead of trying to turn reading into this apolitical, toothless, never examining anything real or difficult kind of space. Anyway, I ended up really, really liking this, and I think despite the fact that there are a couple moments here and there that I had a few qualms with, just a few moments where I felt that Castillo was maybe missing the forest for the trees, maybe approaching certain ideas with a little bit less nuance than I would hope for. Generally, especially as it went on, I would say the essays in the back half were even better than the essays in the first half, and the essays in the first half were great as well. I think I'm sitting at 5 stars for this one, honestly. I kind of waffled back and forth because there were 2 essays in the middle, The Limits of White Fantasy and Main Character Syndrome, which didn't land quite as solidly for me. For The Limits of White Fantasy, I was actually mostly disappointed that the title and the beginning of the essay didn't have that much to do with the direction the essay ended up going in. I was really excited actually by the premise, especially in the first couple paragraphs, of examining the fact that so much white fantasy written by white authors about white characters for a predominantly white audience are pulling from or appropriating oppressive systems, genocide, and more of people of color, of oppressed groups, and then turning the white protagonists into the oppressed, fighting truth to power, the repercussions of telling stories that way. I was really excited for that essay and what would be said and how that would be examined, because I would say, predominantly a fantasy reader. I read pretty widely across many genres, but fantasy is the genre I come back to probably most often. I guess speculative fiction in general, but fantasy is really one of my first loves and a genre that I read constantly. So I have seen evidence of this in my reading, and I was really excited to get more of that. But after the first couple paragraphs, we just sort of pivoted to something completely different and left the idea of examining white fantasy and centering white protagonists as the oppressed in these stories in the dust, and we moved on to something else that I wasn't as interested in, and I felt sad. I mourned the essay we could have had, or the essay I thought we were going to have. Not to say the rest of the essay wasn't interesting, because it was, but I have not seen The Watchmen, which is the TV show that most of the essay is about. So as much as I found it interesting and her thoughts on the show interesting, I didn't have as much of a stake in the essay and in her critique of or commentary on the show, because I have no context for it. I didn't know anything about it before reading the essay, and I now know a little bit about it, but I probably will never watch it. So that one was a little bit of a disappointment for me, and just, I guess, a mismatch of expectations and what actually was delivered. And then the next essay after that, which was Main Character Syndrome, is pretty much entirely about Joan Didion and the problems with her being largely lauded as the representative voice of California. And again, I didn't have any stakes in that situation because I've never read any Joan Didion. I actually bought my first Joan Didion book a few months ago because it was recommended to me as a great book on grief, but I haven't read it yet. Again, I have no context for her work. I just had to kind of take her word for it, and will have to until I read any Joan Didion. Whereas for the other essays, even the ones that were talking about either movies or books or short stories that I hadn't read, I felt that we got a little bit more context, and the essays themselves were less about those specific works and more about a particular idea, and she was using using specific films or short stories or novels to illustrate her point, whereas the main character syndrome chapter was really a takedown of Joan Didion and specifically that, and for that purpose, seemingly. And while there were still quotes I liked, still great points made, really interesting ideas, it was hard for me to connect to an entire essay critiquing the work of an author who I've never read and know very little about. Every other essay for me really landed, and I would say my absolute favorite essay of the whole collection was the one that came right after the Joan Didion essay, which was Reality is All We Have to Love. That one punctured my soul from every direction. It was beautiful. I cried a few times reading it, and in a few of the other essays as well. I guess I should note that as much as this is nonfiction and not an autobiography or a memoir, there is a lot included of Elaine Castillo's own life and her experience of the world, because that's where a lot of this is coming from. Her experience as a bisexual Filipinx author and what the publishing industry has been like for her, what her experience has been as a reader and as an author, and interacting with readers of her own work, and the issues she has seen and the things that she wants to address, the things she thinks we can improve upon. So some of that requires learning more about her and her life, her upbringing, her family, her perspective on the world, how she came to be where she is now. In a few of these essays, she talks about losing her father and that grief and processing that and coming to terms with that, when her father was really the person who brought her into the world of literature and gave her her first framework as a reader. And I'm going to get emotional, but having lost my father a few months ago, and him also having a huge impact on me in terms of introducing me to literature, helping me find my love of books and stories, and always being ready to discuss any book that I read, whether he'd read it or not, and really get into the nitty-gritty and tear it apart and look at the messy innards and really break it down and analyze it and think deeply and care deeply about the books we read, and always willing to take me to the library or get me a new book on tape or buy me a new book for my ever-growing library at home. I owe a lot to my dad for my ability to read and to read critically and to think deeply about the books I read, and it seems like Elaine Castillo had a similar experience, so a lot of what she talked about with her father really resonated and made me very emotional, as you can probably tell now. I really enjoyed this collection. I think it has so many amazing moments, so many great quotes, so many insightful points made. It's very incisive. She is passionate about this, and you can really tell in reading her work how passionate she is. Honestly, the main thing that I would say I disagree with her on would be maybe her perspective on empathy and reading. There's a whole essay, the second essay, that's called Reading Teaches Us Empathy and Other Fictions, and she kind of critiques the idea of using reading as a way to build your empathy. And while I agree with pretty much every point she made in the entire essay, I did have a little bit of a knee-jerk frustration over the framing of it, because she really focused on this idea of people using books, especially books written by marginalized authors, as a learning experience, and sort of expecting authors of color, queer authors, to teach them something with their book, and using it as a way to learn empathy for various groups of people, and kind of requiring a book that teaches them and holds their hand to develop that empathy in the first place. And she, understandably and totally reasonably has an issue with that. And I do too, and I agree totally on that. But I did feel like there was a little bit of a lack of nuance in examining the ways that reading truly can enhance our ability to feel empathy. And I don't mean it in the way that particular books and particular authors should be developing your empathy for you as a reader, but that a reader who already feels empathy and practices empathy in their day-to-day life, ideally, can read widely, diversely, read all kinds of stories from every part of the world, from every different kind of experience over their lifetime, and build this patchwork quilt of little pockets of understanding of different experiences over time. And that quilt just continues to grow and become more intricate and interwoven and expansive. And that quilt, or that tapestry, is your understanding of the world and all of the little fragments of a life, of an experience, of an emotion, of a moment of human connection with an author or a character. And every time you build build that quilt, every stitch, every patch is expanding your understanding of the world. And that's a positive feedback loop where the more you seek out these stories, the more you try to connect with more authors, more characters, more experiences, the more you seek to truly understand on a deep level more and more stories and more diverse stories, the more your empathy grows is maybe the wrong word, but your empathy develops, your empathy evolves. You know to be empathetic about situations that you didn't even know existed before because now you know about them and you understand them, and that deepens your empathy, or that makes your empathy more all-encompassing or more inclusive or more complex. And I do believe in that, and I do think that that is something beautiful, and I do think that it's impossible to have empathy for someone you don't know exists, or to have empathy for a situation you didn't know could happen, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I feel like I'm saying this very clumsily, but that is what I believe is the power of reading, and of reading around the world, reading diversely, reading as many different experiences as you can. That allows you to learn more about the world, and then therefore, like I already said, keep adding to your tapestry or to your quilt of understanding, and that allows you to feel empathy for things that you didn't even know existed before you were exposed to them through literature. Like I said, a bit of a positive feedback loop, and that could be a really powerful tool in a world that currently feels very lacking in empathy. Literacy is going down, people are reading fewer and fewer books, and also people seem to be struggling more and more with the ability to feel empathy and to be emotionally vulnerable and open and to truly listen to each other and try to understand each other. And I do think that's one of the greatest powers of reading. So other than that sort of quibble where I kind of felt like she was missing the forest for the trees a little bit in really niching down to one specific sort of subset of people and one specific conceptualization of reading for empathy, I really enjoy this collection. Like I said, it gave me a lot to think about, and I'm definitely going to be rereading sections that I highlighted and tabbed and continuing to process them. I might do some journaling about some of the things that this brought up, but I would highly recommend this if you're interested in the idea of reading better, reading more critically, reading in a more nuanced, post-colonial, radical, honest, truthful, inclusive, empathetic way. I think that this book has a lot to give and is really well done, and also just very beautifully written. So I would highly recommend. I'm giving this 5 stars. And I guess that means now that I have to spin the wheel again and find out what I'm going to read for the final week of September. Okay, let's spin the wheel again. Here we go. I can't wait to find out what we're going to read next. Finch. So we landed on Finch, and it took me a while to remember what this was. It's Finch by Jeff Vandermeer, and this is book 3 in the Ambergris series, which I haven't started yet. So instead of reading book 3, I'm going to read the first book in the series, which is City of Saints and Madmen. I've been a fan of Jeff Vandermeer's weird sci-fi worlds since I first read the Area X trilogy, which now has 4 books in it, and I do actually have book 4 on my shelves as well. Have not read it yet. I kind of wanted to reread the original trilogy before I read book 4 and haven't gotten around to it. Let me know if you'd want that reading vlog. I was considering filming it for you. But this is supposed to be a series that comes before Area X, which is interesting. Before there was Area X, there was Ambergris. A would-be suitor discovers that a sunlit street can become a killing ground in the blink of an eye. An artist receives an invitation to a beheading and finds himself enchanted. An eccentric guide to Ambergris, written by a down-and-out historian, warns of impending doom for the city. And everywhere on the walls of courtyards and churches, there grows an incandescent fungus of mysterious and ominous origin. Can't wait for the weirdness that I'm sure is about to ensue. Very excited to read more Jeff Vandermeer. it took me a little longer to get to the halfway point of City of Saints and Madmen than I initially expected, so I am going to be officially using a pass to give myself an extra week to finish this. To be totally fair, it's sort of a half pass for How to Read Now and a half pass for this book because I was a couple days over time with How to Read Now, and I thought maybe I could make up that time with this one, but I definitely need a full week, or more like a week and a half to finish this, not only because it's not the shortest book ever, but also just because there's a lot going on. It's a collection of short stories, but every short story has a whole lot going on and is quite layered and complex, and I'm enjoying it, and I'm enjoying it enough that I really don't want to rush through it, you know? So this is so strange, which is what I expected. And I do love strange books, and this is definitely that. I have taken such extensive notes, and I don't want to get into too much great detail because I don't want to talk forever. What can I say about these? The first story, Drayden in Love, was a bit of a rough start for me. I did like it. It's written really beautifully. I loved the prose, and it's very strange and interesting. The world building is very cool. This is seemingly a made-up sort of fantasy and sci-fi world. There's lots of different speculative elements and quite a bit of horror, I would say. But this is a city where there are dwarves and other creatures, but also these mushroom dwellers who are basically a species of people who are sentient mushrooms, and they can't communicate with the people who live in the city. They don't speak the same language, but they exist there as well, and there are lots of mushrooms growing everywhere. And in the first story, we follow Drayden, who is a minister, a pastor, who was on a mission in the jungle, and something happened while he was in the jungle. Won't give anything away, but he's come back, and he's in ambergris, and he's trying to figure out what he's going to do next, what he's going to do with his life. He thought he would be on this mission, converting people in the jungle, and that didn't quite pan out the way he expected. I believe it's on his first day back in the city. He is passing by the Hogboten and Sons building, and he spots a beautiful woman in the window, and he falls in love at first sight. And the whole first story follows Drayden in love, as you might expect, trying to woo and win this mysterious woman in the window. And things take several turns that I didn't personally expect and get quite terrifying, for lack of a better word. And there's a lot going on. You know, we dive a bit into Drayden's psyche. We learn more about his experience in the jungle and what happened back then. We learn more about the world. And we learn that this city is not a very peaceful or safe place to be. And I found it fascinating. I was totally drawn in. I was really engaged with the story. Like I said, the writing was beautiful. The world building is really cool and interesting. Very evocative, great sense of place, lots of strange, eerie, uncanny things happening, which is definitely what I would expect from Vandermeer. I did struggle a bit with the first story because Drayden himself is kind of the worst. Not only because he is a pastor who was trying to convert people to his religion because his religion is clearly better and more civilized and all the rest, which is, you know, hard for me to get on board with for a character in the first place. But then he also falls in love at first sight with this woman, and by love at first sight, I mean objectification at first sight and fetishization at first sight, and he is very misogynistic. It's clearly on purpose. There's clearly some commentary happening, especially as we learn more about his history and what happened in the jungle and what he's dealing with. There's clearly a message coming through that doesn't support people being misogynistic or objectifying, fetishizing people, but still a little hard to read. And it wasn't until a little later in the story when I realized the direction things were going and how it was more of a commentary than just a depiction of a misogynistic religious man who thought he knew better than everyone else. I started to enjoy the story more and be able to appreciate the way it was depicting Drayden as an incredibly messed up person. I think at the end of the day, I would give the first story 4 stars. Definitely did some things I didn't initially expect and was gorier than I thought. So there's that. Then the second story I loved. I loved the second story so much. I think it might be my favorite so far. The Hogboten Guide to the Early History of the City of Ambergris. Ambergris. I don't know. It's written like it's a travel guide for visitors to the city, but it's written by a local historian who feels that writing a travel guide is so beneath him. And there are so many footnotes. I believe there's even more text in the footnotes than there is in the main text. And there are so many jokes. There's so much snarkiness. There's so many footnotes responding to other footnotes. I'll just read one footnote to you so you get the vibe. And this one made me laugh out loud. This is footnote 3. I should add to footnote 2 that the most interesting information will be included only in footnote form, and I will endeavor to include as many footnotes as possible. Indeed, information alluded to in footnote form will later be expanded upon in the main text, thus confusing any of you who have decided not to read the footnotes. This is the price to be paid by those who would rouse an elderly historian from his slumber behind a teaching desk in order to coerce him to write for a common travel guide series. Fantastic. The best thing about the second story is the historian himself and all of his footnotes and his snarkiness and his very clear bias and perspective on every single thing he talks about. He has such a strong personality, such a strong presence within the text, and he's so funny. And then the story itself is really interesting. It really just is a history of the city and explains how we got from when it was first discovered to the modern day, the various rulers and the various wars and the early colonization and the genocide of the Grey Cap who lived there, the mushroom dwellers. And like I said, just absolutely fascinating. It's, I think some people would look at it and feel like it's just info dumping, or it's too much world building, or they don't care about all of these different rulers, political machinations and battles and whatever for a fictional city. But I loved it. I thought it was great. It was fascinating. I read through it so quickly, and almost every single footnote made me laugh, but it also just had so many of the same qualities of the first story of being very evocative, very strong sense of place, very engaging and unique and weird and eerie and creepy and at times terrifying and kind of disgusting, and just this creeping dread. At least I just constantly wanted to know more. I wanted to be able to dive into each little section of history and learn more about the characters and spend time with them and learn more about the Grey Cap and the city and the underground and all the things. So I loved it. 5 stars for the second story. I had a great time with it. And then we get the third story, which was near the end of the book, and for some reason it just came up next in the audiobook, and that was The Cage. And all I can say is wow and oh my god. What a story. Probably the scariest, definitely the scariest of the 3. Both a slow creeping unease, the terror of the unknown and the unseen, but also visceral body horror in the moment terror, and just so fascinating and delightfully strange. They were all engaging, they were all immersive, but The Cage just sucked me in to the point where I was planning on reading for a little bit and then moving on and doing other things, and I just sat there, read the whole thing in one sitting because it was so fascinating and I couldn't look away and it was so intense and I needed to know what was going to happen, and I was just on the edge of my seat gripping my chair like, oh my god, what is happening right now? It was so good. So also 5 stars for The Cage. And if you couldn't tell, I'm really liking this so far. I have no idea where the rest of the stories are going to go. I have no idea if they're going to completely shift in tone, what's going to happen plot-wise, if any of the characters we've met in the other stories are going to come back again. I mean, they already have connections between all 3 of them and some overlap, but it'll be interesting to see where it goes. But I'm really loving this so far. I'm having a lot of fun with it, and I'm very excited that the wheel landed on it. Vandermeer's Mind. I don't even know if I want to know what it's like in there. It must be terrifying and strange and overwhelming. And chaotic, but it leads to awesome, weird books of speculative fiction, so I'm not mad about it. So I think that's it for me. I don't know if I want to do spoilers yet. I might wait till I finish it so that I have a full picture of the whole book, and then if there are spoilers that I want to talk about kind of in an overview way, I can do that at the end. But I think I just what I know is I just want to go and finish reading this because I'm having such a fun time with it. So I'm going to do that. What a weird book this is. Hello friends, I'm back and I have finished City of Saints and Madmen by Jeff Vandermeer. This took me an extra week to finish. Just putting it out there. I am using a pass for this. It took me an extra week. This is a bit dense. It's quite long, at least 550, 600 pages, something like that. But then also just the format of it being all of these interconnected short stories, and some of the formats of the stories are quite laborious to read, for lack of a better term. So, with that out of the way, a little bit of housekeeping, let's chat about this book, because what a strange, not so little compendium of stories. I really liked this overall for the most part. I will say the first half is stronger than the second half for me personally. Like I mentioned, I think in the first half update, I was doing a simultaneous read, listening to the audiobook while reading with my eyes. And in the audiobook, it inserted a story from the second half, The Cage, into the first half and not tacked on to the end, but tacked sort of in the middle. And I wish it hadn't done that for a couple reasons. First of all, just out of order, which was confusing and strange to me, but also it quickly dawned on me that the audiobook version just finished basically in the first half. It didn't include any of the second half other than the story The Cage, which was interesting. And I feel like The Cage would have made more sense and would have landed, I mean, it landed great. Spoiler alert, again, The Cage is probably my favorite story from this whole collection, from this entire novel, however you want to define it. But I think it would have hit even harder, possibly, if it had sit in its original position, if I'd read it sort of in the intended order, especially the Hoagboten family history is right before The Cage, and then The Cage has a protagonist who is part of the Hoagboten family. I think it would have been nice to read that story first. It kind of feels like an introduction to The Cage or a bit of a mini prequel, and separated from The Cage as an independent little family history, it didn't move me. I wasn't all that engaged. I didn't find it particularly memorable, but I think in combination with The Cage, it would have made both hit harder. So I'm kind of confused by the choice to separate them and then just to not, I guess, just not to include the family history at all. But also because I felt like the first half was so much stronger than the second half, but The Cage was my favorite story and it's in the second half, I just feel like removing The Cage made the difference even more stark. The second half was largely lacking in any stories that really jumped out at me, will really stick with me. I think the only story in the second half that I'm giving more than 3 stars, I guess technically 2, I'm giving Learning to Leave the Flesh 3.5 stars. And then In the Hours After Death, which was a very short story, that one I gave 5 stars because I read The Cage in the first half because of the order of the audiobook. I only had 1 5-star story in the second half, whereas in the first half, I had 3 5-star stories back to back in the order that I read them. So it's just quite a big difference, I would say, in the enjoyment level for me personally. And I did feel like the second half dragged a lot. There were a couple stories and a couple more experimental choices that were interesting, but just dragged on way too long for me. The entire glossary, no. Just no. By the time I got to the end, I had no patience for that. And kind of the same for the bibliography of The King Squid. The King Squid in general, I was really looking forward to because I'd seen it listed in reviews as people's favorite story or one that really stuck with them. And for me, it just felt so out of left field, kind of irrelevant to the rest of the collection. Not that a collection of short stories or novel has to be hyper-focused on one idea or on one sort of mysterious, horror, creepy element, but this book was so focused. So many of these stories were focused on ambergris society and, in conjunction with that, the Grey Caps and fungus, and that kind of constant growth and transformation and decay, and that concept and those ideas are played out and reflected in the characters and their journeys and in the city itself. And to have a whole story focused on the squid, these giant squid that apparently live in this not too big river. For me, it just felt a little meandering, irrelevant. I didn't mind the story, but I just wasn't sure how it connected or why I should care about these squid. In the context of the greater collection, it just felt out of place and more disconnected from the other stories. I also felt like the thing that people seem to bring up and that they seem to enjoy about it is the structure, the way it's written as a bit of an academic essay with this way too long bibliography at the end that has kind of a secondary story in the notes of the bibliography. For me, it felt like this was just to, make myself sound like one of the fellow kids. It felt like it was reheating the nachos of the Hoagboten Guide to the Early History of the City of Ambergris. It just was the same structure, the same sort of snappy, intellectual with all their notes and commenting on how everyone else is clearly very stupid because they don't understand the truth, and, kind of telling extra stories in the footnotes or in the bibliography in this case. It just felt like it was doing the same thing, but not as well. I wasn't as engaged by it. I didn't find it as funny. I wasn't as attached to the narrator, writer, character, and the bibliography was so long. I wouldn't have minded it if it was half as long, but it just, I kid you not, I think the bibliography was like 30 pages, 40 pages. It's from page 51 in the second half to 88. Altogether too long. And the little bit of a story that comes in the notes on the bibliography for me was pretty predictable and not that engaging and didn't make up for how long the bibliography was. I also found a lot of the humor in the bibliography was trying a little too hard, whereas the humor in the footnotes in the earlier story felt more at ease with themselves, if that makes sense. When I read the first half, when I did the halfway update, I was thinking this is going to be easily a 5-star read. I'm loving so many of these stories. This is so creepy and atmospheric and strange and interesting. And then the second half hit and it was a bit laborious. Yeah, it was a bit of a slog there at times. So I think I'm coming out at 4 stars, trying to balance how I felt about all the different stories. And I will briefly go through the stories and kind of give you an overview of my thoughts and individual story ratings, but I do really love the idea of this as a whole. I'm very excited to read on in this series. I think this world is fascinating. The gray caps I want to know more about. If I had one point of criticism other than maybe feeling like the second half was drawn out too long and the king squid feeling kind of out of place, would be that I want to know more about the gray caps. Maybe if the king squid was swapped out with a story that dove more into their underground and their religion and their society, that would have been cool. But my understanding is that the rest of the series, or I believe the rest of the series, dives into it more. So hopefully that's the case. Loved that this felt in equal measure horrifying and hilarious. Loved it. Found the tone very enjoyable to read. It's very meta, definitely leaning into metafiction, very layered, complex. A lot of the stories feel completely disconnected, but then as you read them, you realize that they actually have a lot in common, or there are actually characters that appear in this story and then are mentioned in this story, or you get to the end of a story that feels irrelevant to everything else, interesting but irrelevant, and then there's a final reveal that makes you realize that it actually connects to all these other things in these various ways. So very interesting the way that was done. I really enjoyed the through line between the stories of this idea of colonization, both literal colonization and genocide, but also this metaphor of the colonization of the city, of buildings, and of people by the fungus, by this constantly growing, insidious life form that can kind of make its way through any crack. And that's just a layer that I didn't necessarily expect going into it, but I feel really added to the overall horror and grotesque quality of the fungus. It's very unsettling, very creepy, very gross at times. Quite a bit of social commentary in general, both on the idea of colonization and genocide, but also politics and religion in general, the fervor and changeability of politics and political factions and religions, religious beliefs, and just the idea of transformation in general is such a constant through line across the stories and across the many different characters. Lots of questionable reality and mystery and madness and unease. Just very, very interesting. Really enjoyed it. Loved the writing style. Okay, so let me go story by story. First of all, we have Drayden in Love, which was honestly a very confrontational first story of the collection. I feel like it really knocks you over the head with how strange this is going to be. It is a really interesting window into the city of Ambergris. Drayden himself as a character was very hard to like, and I did struggle a bit with this story with sort of the conceit, the concept, the premise, and as we learn more about Drayden, I disliked him more and more, but I do feel like the story kind of turns your expectations on their head. It went in a really interesting direction, and I found it fascinating and satisfying, and I ended up feeling like it was worth the little bit of discomfort and frustration with Drayden as a character in the beginning of the story, so I gave Drayden in Love 4 stars. Really gets you into the world of this story and also allows you to realize how mysterious and creepy and unsettling and dangerous and violent and uneasy the city of Ambergris is. Then we get into one of my favorite stories of the collection, and this one is tied for second place, which is The Hoboken Guide to the Early History of the City of Ambergris by Duncan Shriek, which makes me excited because I think the third book, or the second book, is called Shriek, so hopefully that means we get more of him because he was amazing. This is the one that is really just giving you the history of the city as if written by an academic, and there are a bunch of footnotes in which he is bitching about all the other academics who don't know what they're talking about and historical figures he doesn't like very much, and sharing his own ideas. It was hilarious, it was informative, it's a really clever way to essentially info dump the entire history of the world in a very entertaining way. I loved it. I found it both fascinating to learn about the world, but I also really liked Duncan Shriek and very much enjoyed his voice and all the footnotes. Very engaging, despite being pretty dense history of a made-up city. So 5 stars for that story, and like I said, tied for my second favorite of the collection. Then the next one that I read technically was The Cage, but I'm gonna leave that for where it actually sits in my copy as I go through, so put a pin in that. The next book in my copy in order is The Transformation of Martin Lake, and this one is tied with the last story for second place. Another 5-star story. This one, again, playing with this idea of metafiction, because we're focused on Martin Lake, who is a painter, and we're introduced to the story by an art critic, the owner of an art gallery who knew him in life, who's talking about his work. And then throughout his story, we get little interludes of this art critic explaining how she interprets his art. And it was just such an interesting way to add depth to the story, to give us even more of a window into Martin Lake's psyche and to understand some of the events that are happening in the main story even more through this extra context of how he painted about his experiences later. And while the art critic doesn't know all the background or the reality of some of the situations that his paintings are based on, she still manages to be very observant and pick up on some things that I felt, if the paintings were real and she were real, I would be very impressed by her ability to really read into the subtext of his artistic choices. And I just really enjoyed those sections, I must admit. I guess I'm a nerd because I loved them. And this story in general was really great. Definitely a story of transformation, as you would expect from the title. Martin Lake is a really interesting figure, and we learn even more about the world here, especially the political and religious climate of Ambergris and this tendency to this fervor and changeability. But we also get to learn more about Lake himself, and he was such an interesting figure. And then to watch his transformation from a little-known painter to a much beloved painter of this quite grotesque, unsettling art, and where the inspiration for his art actually came from in his life. Fascinating. And I would say of these first 3 stories, if you were to read them in order, this one is the most horror. I really loved it. So 5 stars for The Transformation of Martin Lake. Okay, then we have The Strange Case of X. This one was okay for me. I give it 3 stars. I don't think there was anything wrong with it. It just didn't jump out to me as much as some of the other stories. Also, again, very meta. In this case, X seems to be based on Vandermeer himself, and it's this idea of a writer who is writing the world of Ambergris, is writing stories set in Ambergris, and then starts to believe it's real. I enjoyed it well enough while I was reading it, but I wasn't as emotionally drawn in some of the other stories, in part because of the writing style, and for large part it's sort of written almost like a play in dialogue back and forth. But I also just found it a little bit less horrifying and unsettling and engaging as some of the other stories. Again, it was totally fine. It was good. I gave it 3 stars, but just not my favorite of the collection, I would say. I didn't quite connect to X as a character as much as the other protagonists. I feel like in every other story, even if I didn't love the protagonist, like with Drayden, at least I felt like I really knew him. With X, I felt like there was quite a bit of distance, which is interesting because he does seem to be sort of based on Vandermeer himself. Okay, then we get into the appendix, and there are kind of a few very short stories or little letters and notes between characters that I'm not really rating separately. Then we get into King Squid, which was one of my least favorite stories in this collection. Again, I think if it had been its own thing separate from this, I would have liked it a lot more. But by the time I got to it, I had less patience for it. It just felt like a repeat of one of my favorite stories in this collection. For me, King Squid was 2 stars. I think out of the context of the rest of this story and with half as long of a bibliography, it would have easily been 3 stars, maybe even 4 stars, but felt like my time was being purposefully wasted with that bibliography, and I found it very annoying. Then we get into the Hoagboten family history. This story in and of itself was fine. It was interesting, but again, didn't quite draw me in as much, didn't feel like it had as much heart, and felt more like an introduction or an overview to give us the context we needed for the cage, which is why I feel like it's so strange that they would eliminate it from the audiobook version. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts, or at least it is improved by being in connection to the cage, I would say. Then we get the cage, which is my favorite story in this whole collection. This is by far the creepiest, the most horror forward story, the most unsettling, has the most body horror, and really is the most immersed into this idea of the creepy fungus. So I loved it for that reason. I also just found the writing to be fantastic. The character work was great. Our protagonist and his wife have a very sort of wholesome, domestic, sweet relationship. And in some ways, this felt like a story that was more about examining grief and loss and the pain of the unknown, of losing someone without getting all the answers, that I found quite beautiful and touching. But it was also gorgeously written, very well paced, terrifying, deeply unsettling and gross at moments. I loved it. 5 stars for the cage. Definitely my favorite and the one that will stick with me most from this whole collection. Then we get In the Hours After Death. This one's quite a short story and I really liked it as well. I gave it 5 stars. Because it's so short, I'm not sure it will stick with me as much as some of the longer stories, but I really enjoyed it. I felt like it used just the right amount of pages to get this idea across, and I found it, again, quite unsettling, again tying into this idea of the fungus and the horror of the colonization of someone's body with fungus. Also kind of dealing with themes of grief and loss. I do wish I could have read it right after The Cage as it is listed in the book again, instead of, I'm just annoyed, can you tell, by the audiobook not having the second half and then just randomly putting The Cage in the middle of the first half as if that's how it was meant to be. Very strange choices. This letter had an encryption at the end, which maybe it is possible to unencrypt this in my version, but I tried and it didn't seem like it was properly formatted for it, so I ended up having to look up what the unencrypted final paragraph was. I liked it well enough, but it didn't jump out to me quite as much as some of the other stories. Same with the exchange. It was interesting. There were aspects of it that I liked. I thought the end of it was quite well done, but again, just sort of didn't make as much of an impression on me. I think I'm leaning towards giving it 3 stars. I would say The Man Who Had No Eyes, which is the story with the encrypted final paragraph, probably would be 4 stars, but because I was annoyed that it seemed like it wasn't possible in my version to unencrypt it, but they still put in the code, unless I'm missing something, brings it down to a 3 star for me, just because that's annoying. And then the final story in the collection before we get into the glossary, which I'm not even going to talk about because I'm annoyed by it existing, and it again feels like kind of it's wasting my time. But Learning to Leave the Flesh was a really interesting story. Different tone to the rest of the collection in some ways. It definitely felt like Vandermeer kind of writing his own experience again, but writing his experience into Ambergris, which was interesting. I'm sort of sitting around 3.5 stars, probably rounded down to 3. I thought it was interesting again, but maybe not quite as connected or relevant and not quite as impactful for me. Once again, the 2 stories that felt like they had a protagonist based on Vandermeer himself, I felt the most disconnected from the protagonist, which is weird, you know? Maybe I'm misinterpreting who is based on Vandermeer and who isn't, but it's just a thing I noticed. So those are my hopefully pretty concise thoughts on all of the different stories in this collection. I don't think I'm going to get into spoilers just because if I were to share spoiler thoughts on each of these stories, I would probably easily talk for an hour. But if you've read this and you have specific things you want to talk about or specific spoilery things you want to discuss, please leave a comment down below. I'd be happy to chat more with you about this and all the books I read in this video. Maybe if you are going to share a comment with spoilers, just say spoilers for City of Saints and Madmen, and then hit enter a couple times so that the actual spoilers are hidden by the read more on YouTube. But also I apologize. It's very cloudy today, so the sun keeps going behind the clouds and then coming out. So this lighting is probably going to be absolutely wild. I'll try to fix it in post, but we'll see how much I can actually do that. Please try to ignore it. Sometimes I just really have to film a video and I have no choice, even though it is a cloudy day and I know it's going to make my life a living hell because of the lighting. But anyways, that is City of Saints and Madmen. What a weird, wild ride. My brain feels a little bit like it's been infiltrated by fungus, but in a good way. And I think right now I'm sitting at 4 stars for this. I think that feels fair considering how much I adored some of these stories and how absolutely frustrated, almost angry I got at some of the other stories. I'm definitely very excited to read the rest of this series. I'm tempted to pick it up right away, but I also have a lot of other reading I have to do this month, so we'll see if that's possible. So that is City of Saints and Madmen, and that makes it the 4th and final read for this Read It or Unhaul It reading vlog. If I were to rank them, I think it would be like this. The Master and Margarita is my favorite, then How to Read Now, then City of Saints and Madmen, then Rouge Street. But a very tight race, 2 5-star reads, 2 4-star reads, all fascinating, all books that I'm very glad that I purchased and had on my shelves, even if it took me a while to read them, and I'm glad that the wheel landed on them because they were all fascinating. And so many tabs were used. Oh yeah, actually, I had some questions, I think, either on Instagram or in the comments of the last reading vlog to say what my keys were for the 4 books. So I don't think I'm going to read that out loud because that would be a bit much, but I think I'll pin a comment on this video and I will write out my key for each of the 4 books in case you're curious. But that's it for this video. I'm going to spin the wheel for my first pick for October, but I will save that to the next reading vlog. You can follow me on Instagram and or TikTok if you want to find out much earlier than the next vlog coming out what my next read is and what my thoughts are. You can follow along week by week if you follow me on one of those platforms. That is it for me. I'm imagining this is going to be a very long video, so I won't drag it out any longer. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you really soon in my next one. Bye, friends. I can't wait another day to see you, how embarrassing to be this way. I'm in a reckless fever, love-struck girl, I tease her, thought I'd never be her, quite the job you've done on me, sir. I've been hosting parties, in my mind I'm working overtime to have you in my world. Oh, what a curse it is to be your lover, girl.